This week we'll be talking about the Great Depression, which I guess technically occurs in 1929 and goes through the 1930s. We're going to talk about, why it occurred in this video segment and the initial federal government response, okay? Because FDR's response that we're going to learn about with the New Deal is much different than the initial response. So let's start talking about that. One thing we need to keep in mind is what we learned about with the 1920s. It was an opulent time in the United States, full of consumerism. And so from 1922 to 1929, the stock market itself was what we call a bull market, okay? So foolproof. Everybody was investing in it. People borrowed on stock. So if they didn't have, or borrowed on margin, I'm sorry. So if they didn't have the money, they would just borrow money from the bank. Basically, it said you pay $1 up front and you get $10 worth of stock, okay? And then you would repay them with whatever money you made it. So it's kind of like dangerous stock market investments. So of course, Black Thursday was, October 24th of 1929. There were rumors that the market was actually about to collapse, and some nervous investors, because of that, withdrew their money, which absolutely plummets the stock market, okay? So on Black Tuesday of 1929, October 29th, that's when the stock values dropped. That's what we call the stock market crash, or what we refer to it as. But they fell between 10 and 15 billion. I'm going to dispel some myths on this, though, and we're going to dispel it. And there's a video called The Myths of the Great Depression, which I really encourage you to watch, because a lot of people think that this is what caused the Great Depression. And although it was like the initial trigger, it's not really what plummets the United States into a Great Depression itself. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute, okay? So what were the effects of the crash on investors, okay? Especially investors that borrowed on margin. This becomes a big issue. Some of them really do lose their fortunes overnight. But again, most people in the United States really didn't invest in the stock market. There were a lot of people that did, but not the amount I think that a lot of people perceive, okay? The biggest effect that the stock market crash really was have the effect on the banks. So that's what we really, really need to think about, okay? And these things were called bank runs. So if you remember nothing from the Great Depression, this is probably the biggest thing you really need to focus on here. So basically what happened was that the banks themselves did make some investments in the stock market, right? But people began to get worried because the stock market crashed, right, and all the news that was out there and everything like that, that the banks would not have their money, okay? And I don't know how much you're familiar with banking and the way it's done, but you're probably aware that your bank doesn't just sit on your money and wait for you to come pick it up. The bank, invests in things like businesses. They give people home loans. They do things like that. So they use that money. They earn interest, or they make investments themselves. And they make money off the money, basically. So if everybody comes to the bank and they withdraw their money all at the same time, it's going to collapse the bank. Okay, and that's essentially what happened. One of the video clips I'm going to show you is from the movie It's a Wonderful Life, which is a great movie to begin with, but it's the scene about the bank runs, okay, and what Jimmy Stewart's character, he justifies why it's important for people to keep their money in the bank. So this I'm trying to push on you is very important, because it's going to be very important with the way that FDR responds to the banking crisis and to the way he approaches the Great Depression, okay? Okay, so, the effects on business obviously are really that the banks could not give money to, because they crashed, a lot of them failed. They couldn't give money to potential investors, potential businesses in order to expand their businesses because it wasn't there. Okay, and so then they couldn't hire people, consumers couldn't buy the goods that they wanted to, companies were worried about the fact that they didn't have access to that money. So again, I can't stress enough, this hit on the banks is really going to take a bigger toll on the United States economy. Okay, so the other thing that's happening in the sidelines is that because of this overconfidence that many people have in the economy during the 1920s, businesses overproduce, and there's not enough consumers to buy the products they have. The same thing with farms. Farms are also overproducing, and there's less demand. a lot of them end up having to sell their farms. And so, this overproduction of business and farms also leans to or creates another issue. The other thing is the fact that credit was given out for the first time in U.S. history in the 1920s. Credit where you didn't necessarily have to have the money, but you could, borrow and buy goods on credit. Well, obviously people were not able to pay back their loans and pay off their credit because there was a lot less demand, and so just the flat-out overuse of credit is also going to affect it. Okay, so this is an important one. This is protective tariffs. And so if you don't understand what tariffs are, let me give you just a real brief explanation of what those are. So a tariff is essentially a tax on an imported good. Okay, and the federal government normally makes money off that. And it's done not just for the taxing purposes, but it's done to lift the prices of imported goods. I'm sorry. Okay, so it lifts the prices of the imports. So it makes American businesses and their products seem much cheaper. So it's seen as a way to protect businesses. But unfortunately, as with most, if not all, tariffs, it had a negative effect on the American economy. So the largest tariff ever in American history was passed, called the Hawley-Smoot tariff, or it might have been the second highest tariff, but it's up there, and basically imposed a huge tax on imported goods in an effort to protect American businesses. However, this does the exact opposite. So businesses that wanted to send their goods overseas, well, those countries slapped a tariff on American businesses because of what we were doing here in the United States, and so they had a very difficult time exporting their goods. Also, this basically sent the entire world into its worldwide depression. Now, there were other things going on in the world too. This is post-World War I, but this just exacerbates the situation and makes it much, much worse. Now, the everyday people, these are probably the pictures we're familiar with, really. The Great Depression and the suffering that happened. I will tell you that African Americans are the hardest hit group in the Great Depression, where it was about a third of the people, white people that were out of work, which is a really high, or close to a quarter to a third, really, that were out of work, which is a very, very high unemployment rate. Almost half of the African Americans were unemployed, which is an astronomical rate. And so this has a huge effect on people. Bread and soup lines, the hobos were that's how they came about, was during the Great Depression. And I love this image right here. I just like to put it up. Let me move myself here a little bit. But this is, they created language, the hobos did, almost like by a house or a business, a way to communicate with each other in order to tell them if the person was friendly, if they would give food and things like that. I just think that's a little bit of fun history, so I like sharing that sometimes. Okay, so another thing that's also happening simultaneously in the United States is the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl essentially was the overgrazing of the Great Plains area in the United States, also in the 1930s. Okay, this also had to do, there's a severe drought. So the combination of the overgrazing and the drought-stricken area, and by the way, this is the area where a lot of people were settling in the homestead. This caused an enormous amount of dust storms, and it causes people to leave the plains and move out west, usually to California. So the people were nicknamed, the people that move out west were nicknamed the Okies, even though some people were from Texas, because they came from Oklahoma and they migrated there. And so there's another great clip from History Story of Us from History Channel about the Dust Bowl, and it goes into an explanation and some reenactment. And so that's a really good clip to watch that I'll place there below about the Dust Bowl and its effects. So this is an important thing, and especially for the discussion that you'll have this week, but essentially Herbert Hoover was the president during that time period, and he was a Republican president. He very much believed that the economy would heal on its own, and he didn't want to create any policy or regulate industry or do anything really to get the country back up on its feet. He believed in something called volunteerism, which is people will volunteer to help out. Unfortunately for Hoover, that does not work. okay? He asked businessmen through this volunteerism to keep the prices the same, keep the wages the same. He didn't want to increase, income taxes, and he didn't want to raise the interest rates. And he felt that this kind of break that he gives to the businesses would funnel down to the worker. And again, I can't stress enough that definitely did not work. Another sad thing that kind of happens is during Hoover's administration, and this happens in 1924, Congress approved, the approval for the bonus happened in 1924, approved for veterans of World War I to get a bonus. The bonus wasn't supposed to be paid until later. However, because of the Great Depression, 20,000 vets marched on Washington, or asked for their bonuses early because they were suffering. So instead of addressing the needs of these vets or anything like that, Hoover's response was to send federal troops to disperse them. And some people were killed during that. Not many, but some. But obviously this is seen as not supportive of vets and dismissive of the suffering of the American people. And so this is obviously seen as a pretty negative thing. The American people absolutely blamed Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression. They lived in, a lot of them, had to move out of their homes, and they lived in these little shanty towns outside on the outskirts of the cities and they nicknamed them Hoovervilles. And they nicknamed this because they blame Hoover for the Great Depression. And so this was interesting. They've got, I don't think anybody was actually trying to sell their children. I think that, I know that picture's over there. By the way, I meant to address that there. Nobody's actually selling their children, at least that I know of. But anyway, they were definitely suffering, and Hoover absolutely is going to be blamed, okay? So in the next election, in the election of 1932, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is the fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, he runs for president as a Democrat under something he promises as the New Deal. He felt that the federal government, and this is where it's important because this is going to be your discussion this week, he believed that the federal government needed to play a very active role in helping solve these economic problems. He was very different than Hoover, okay? So he believed that it was the federal government's job to protect the people and to help people. He wins in an absolute landslide victory. Okay, so this is Hoover's win in 1928. Check out Roosevelt's win. Okay, you can obviously see that people absolutely blamed him. And in the next presentation, this is really what I'm going to talk about in FDR. When he becomes president, he creates in his first 100 days 15 new bills to help people, fireside chats in order to communicate to the people, and he develops something known as the Relief, Recovery, and Reform Programs under the New Deal. Okay, we'll nickname these alphabet soup because there's so many programs that he creates that a lot of people have a hard time kind of keeping up with all of them. But we'll talk about that in the next presentation, and you will find out why it is that FDR was such an incredibly popular president.